All right, we thank you all for joining me. Today we're going to get into um, Lecture 10, Intro to Integrated Theology, and we're moving closely to completing the class. Altogether, there may be 30-some lectures, so I don't know exactly how many. And I've already prepared for the next class. We're going to take a deeper dive. And so let's get into our lecture for today. Just a friendly reminder, make sure that you have all of your screens muted and just on one single device so we won't have any backfield noise. And so let's begin. Today we're going to talk about understanding the categorical structure. We talked a little before class and we discussed that in philosophy is much more comprehensive than many people consider. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why in theological circles, two words are anathema. One word is, of course, science. The other is philosophy. And I think that's one of the biggest errors that we could ever make because number one, again, we who study theology and the scripture, we understand first mention or first presentation. First presentation means we go back to the premise. The premise ideologica simply means that we go back to the very first mention and the originator, or the law of the auctoritas. He who authored the thing is the one that has set into motion those things, as well as the meanings of those things. And so we understand that all knowledge comes from God because he is omniscient. And so omniscience simply means that he is omniscientia, and he knows every branch of knowledge, every branch of understanding, every perspective of it, every time frame of it, every dimension of it. And with our minds, that's not possible to even gain an understanding unless God allows you to do so, because we're talking about a mind that is pro-calculated, pro-preempted, where he already knows every possible outcome of every question, every solution, every answer before the question even arises. And so to be what we call omnisciential simply means then that he knows every foundation of knowledge. He knows every seed of knowledge, what every seed will become once it germinates. He knows every root cause of knowledge, every root cause of confusion. He understands every degree of logic, even the logic of illogic. And so as a mind, he is the primus mens, the first mind, the first thinker who produced the first thought. And when we talk about producing as a verb, then we talk about God in what we call eternality or eternal actions, which when we talk about, again, something being infinitely active, there is no beginning, there is no end, there is no differentiation, there can be no time, which means he has always known what he knows. He has always thought about what he knows, and he has always been aware of himself, being aware of what he knows. And so when we deal with God, then we have to move beyond time and space, even the minciological time and space of beginning to think. And so he is the, what I call monadic minciological mind. And this monadic minciological mind means that God and his thoughts are one. And every thought is the same thought. And again, we're going to talk about God as if he's human, because we will say, how then can every thought be the same thought? Well, because every thought is the thought of his eternal purpose. And so let's dive right in. In the field of philosophy called ontology, there exists the theory of categories. And I want to be informal today and just take my time because it's a lot of information. This theory consists of the following: the categories of being. Remember, one of the first principles of knowledge is being is. And that which is must be. It is either in existence or it isn't. And we covered this last week, talking about the different sectors. Some say there are 7 first principles, but basically there are 5, and these 5 contain principles within principles. And so this theory consists of, again, the categories of being. It begins with the categories of the highest being. And the highest being then would be the categorical structures in which God himself has developed. And when we speak of categories, because we're still talking about the monadic mind, we're simply talking about the expressions of God's eternal purpose, what God has always desired, what God has always understood, what God has always known, and what God was always thinking in his minciological logos. Minciological logos, when we talk about it, then talks about the mind that is differentiating, or the mind that is categorizing the thoughts for the purpose of manifesting them. And so it begins with categories of the highest, and the highest then would be genera or kinds of entities. And so he has categorized things. First of all, he himself, he knows that he is God. He has ever known that he is God. He has ever known. When we speak of God, then we're talking about Jehovah Elohim. He has always known that he self-exists. He has always known that he never came into existence. And he has always known that he is Elohim, the all-powerful one with all displays of possible capabilities, powers, abilities, and unique modes of operating. Because again, when there was nothing, God was still operating. When there was nothing, God was still omnipresent. When there was nothing, God was still omnipotent. Even though some say that his omnipresence was one of the final characteristics to come into, I'll say, operation, because where was there to operate except for God himself? But when we talk about within God, we're still talking within the myriad of dimensions of his mind, the myriad of dimensions of thought, myriad of dimensions of his emotive stance, where he is moved to do because of what he is responding to, and he's responding to his own ideologies, principles, concepts, and desires. And so categories are ways to, number one, organize group-specific content under a common umbrella. And so categorical thinking is organizational thinking. And so God organizes things under a umbrella that is within a group specific. And so the goal is to organize and to manifest what has been organized in a systemic and orderly fashion. Categorization is a part of prolegomena. It's very interesting, again, because you're going to hear this word consistently. Prolegomena, again, from the word pro, which means before, and legomena, before the speaking. So pro plus legging, to say. And so there is a basic foundation of pro, which is thought. And thought ties in legomena, or the speaking, which is the manifestation of what you're thinking. And so prologos, even before you think in a discursive way, you're thinking in a categorizational way to bring structure and organization. And so the legging, and again, you have to be very careful about the what I call word correct, because it will change every Greek word and everything. And so the prolegin is actually the action of mentally gathering genesiologically. When we talk about genesiological, we're talking about from the field of generating something in a beginning or creating. And so gathering genesiologically is creating the ontology of dimensions of thought, of principles. The dimensions of thoughts can be, first of all, distillational principles, distillational concepts or ideas, and then distillational discourse. So those three dimensions, they begin with principles, with the foundational beginnings, and then concepts, which are the basic beginnings, becoming now idealistic into things that can be expanded into discourse or lengthy discussions or thoughts concerning the information. And so the gathering of genesiological processes of thought, creating the ontology of dimensions. Whenever you hear ontology, ontology can be applied to just about any type of discipline. Ontology, then, the ontology of science is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom. What is its origin? What is its extent? What are the characteristics of knowledge? When we talk about chemistry, what is the origin of chemistry? What are the origin of chemicals? How were they formed? What is the extent of the knowledge we can have on that? So ontology just simply means origin or beginnings to bring about an understanding of the nature of the thing that you're proposing. So genesiological gathering is, again, the creation of the appropriate perimeters. And these perimeters will reveal, number one, the purpose. What is the purpose of the thing in question? And in this question, we're talking about then integrated theology. What is the purpose of it? What is the purpose of any branch of theology? Did man just discover that there was a knowledge about God, or did God implant a script in man that would cause him to go back searching for his beginnings and the beginnings of all things? And of course, I believe the latter. Number two, the reason for the purpose. God does not do things just out of sight, out of mind, and just happenstance ago. With every action of God, there is a plan and a purpose, and there is a reaction or response to it to bring about what God so desires to take place. Excuse me. Number three, the process of developing a strategy. What goes into stratagem? Why does God use certain strategies to fulfill specific outcomes? How does he develop the knowledge? Or again, when we talk about develop, talking about present tense, it's really not applicable as it relates to God, because he is always settled in what he knows, what he's going to do. And the plan has always been a part of his eternal existence. Number four, the implementation of the process. There are processes that God has already and always had developed that he implements in the schema of time, because he knows when it should be implemented. And that again goes back to the knowledge and the wisdom of God, knowing when to apply eternal knowledge, knowing when to assimilate into a process to bring about the portion of his eternal plan and will, his eternal consideration, even if it is not totally being revealed or implemented. And that takes precise information. It's very important. I was sharing with someone when we talk about cellular development, cells then develop on the basis of information within that cell. And so it begins to divide. And in its division, it's kind of monadic. It divides into the same cell, same process, either through mitosis or meiosis. But then something miraculous happens, and information from outside of the cell is added to the cell to give it its differentiation. And so here we see the process of developing a strategy. The cell is encoded to divide and to grow, but then God orders its next stage of growth into specificity. And so that reveals then that because there are living cells, that God is still invested in the living cells, and God is still the determinant of what these cells will become. And only He knows that because of His foreknowledge. Then number 5, the objective, which is the conclusion. And so genesiological gathering will take place in these 5 arenas: the purpose, the reason for the purpose, the process of developing a strategy to fulfill the purpose, the implementation of the process, and the objective, what is the conclusion of the matter. And so the prolegane, it requires, number 1, minciological ontology. Minciological ontology is the originating thought process that create the various levels of contributing information. And so mens, it is the mind, minciology. The reason why I prefer this term over psychology, because psychology is studying the soul and the complexities of its integration within the body, and how the mind or the psyche is integrated into the 3 mindsets that Freud called ego, superego, and the id, and those expressions of higher thought, unconscious thought, and then carnal thought, or the flesh being active. And so when we speak of mens, we're talking about not necessarily the partitions of the mind. And when I say partitions, because the mind is what we would call non-physical, it is immaterial. Then in its immateriality, there are still what we would call borders of operations, or borders of schematic operation processes: intellect, where the cognition and the learning takes place; emotive, where all of the expressions and reactions; and volition, where all of the choices that are based upon our desire and what we want. And the will then becomes the determining factor of the shaping of our personality, because with the will we choose to perspectivize based upon what we want and desire. And so in a sense, we become the author of who we will become mentally. Because if any other way this took place, then God is ordering and causing us to think a certain way, which gets rid of all free will. And so minciological ontology then means dealing with the mind, the power of the mind as a mind. The mind has the complexity of thought, and the mind in its complexity can then have variations of thoughts. And these variations will either be emotive, designed to move us to do, or reflective, designed for us to take information to correspondingly understand it, and transform it into usable information, and then the volition, coming to a point where we can utilize intelligence in the intellectual way, intelligence in an emotional way, and intelligence in a volitional way. So all of those aspects of the mind must be trained to become intelligent, or we will make choices that are unintelligent and that will not benefit us. We will make choices emotionally that just have us moving every time we feel whatever, or we will make choices based solely on what we call the analytical, which leaves no room for exploration of the heart, the feeling, or the release of the Spirit of God to bring us into an emotive state that is moved by the Spirit. And so MENS, the study of the actions of the mind. And so it treats the mind as the topic itself, and not necessarily the integration of the mind into the hardwiring. So logically, the mensiological ontology must include, number one, submission to the mens of God. Excuse me. This submission to the mens, or the active mind of God, is allowing God to determine what information should be received. And so here again, we see categorically, why does God choose to give us certain information about certain things and then cause us to desire to explore other information? So in our exploration, we are gaining experience with how to handle it. Why does he allow us to think, to ponder, to research, to discover? Because in the process, he's teaching us how to exercise form and build the mens to its greatest capacity so it can be used for him and by him. Information that is given will fulfill a specific purpose of God. And so everything that God gives to you has a purpose. And in most cases, we either ignore or we are not aware of the purpose. What is the purpose of God drawing you to studying integrative theology? What is the purpose of God trying to get us to expand our minds so we can invariably begin to operate in a higher level of spiritual consciousness, spiritual thought? Is it just simply to make us better? Or are we becoming custodians of the future exploration of the minds of others? And if so, then how important is that? And how tragic is that when we do not develop ourselves the way God wants? Do we hold the future of the minds of people in our hands? And what are we doing with their future if we do not expose them to the highest level of mensiological development that is possible? The specific purpose will benefit those whom God has given this information to, as well as those who will also receive this information from them. And so all good and perfect gifts come from the Father of lights from up above. And so if knowledge is a gift, then the fulfillment of knowledge, or the learning of knowledge, should bring about a change in our mind, our soul, and invariably how we respond to the Spirit. Further submission to the enlightening Logos of God, for the purpose of, again, we're talking about submission to the mens of God. It allows God to determine what information should be received. And so further submission to the Logos of God brings about the fulfillment of the purpose of organizing the information into usable information. What is usable about the exploration of time and dimensions? What is useful about knowing what we would call eternal past, eternal present, eternal future. What is the use of understanding the time frame in which God moves? Because he is eternally with knowledge, then God is always moving from the eternal past to implement what he already knew in the past, saw in the past, desired in the past for the present. And the present is ever encroaching upon the future. We look to the future only for it to become the present, and the present then becomes the past. Even if it's 2 seconds ago, it is in the past. And so we operate in the fluctuations of time to understand the knowledge and the mind of God. And this also reveals his transcendence beyond space and time, because he's never bound by time. He's always operating in an existence before time. And so his knowledge is of old, or of ancient, of days. And when we speak of days, days can be the equivalent of ages. Days can be the equivalent of what we call eons, depending on God's specificity. And so organizing the information into usable information is God's desire. Using the information then to synthesize and clarify concepts, principles, truths, and visualization of the information into what we call mental imagery or imagination. And so the synthesis or the synthesizing of information, again, starts with the distillation of a seed. The seed is a word. Within a word can be, I'll say, an ultimate understanding of many complexities, because one word literally can have so much of a meaning that needs to be constructed. So principles can come, and the principles will give birth to concepts, and the concepts will give birth to what I call discursive truth. Every principle has truth to it if it comes from God. Every concept has truth to it if it comes from God. And then every truth can be formulated into a discourse, whether it be doctrinal or whatever. And so imagination is the faculty or the action of forming new ideas, images, concepts, and principles. These formations are generally external objects that are not present to the senses, and thus the term minciological ontology. In other words, when you are imagining, you are dealing with concepts that you have not yet constructed, visualizations of things you have not yet constructed. You are in your imagination now creating and categorizing thoughts that will become foundational thoughts, that will become principles, that will become concepts, and will become discourses. Minciological ontology is the study of the origin or the origin of mental ideals, images, concepts, principles that are new to the thinker. That's why you must imagine them. Remember, when we speak of imagination, imagination then speaks about the using of information to synthesize. Synthesize is constructing concepts, principles, and truths. So all categories begin as distilled impulses. So these distilled units, and again, you have to watch your computer. So all, again, categories begin as distilled units of information. These units are quanta units. Quanta units, then, very small. The smallest part of a unit is what we call quanta. So when we speak of quantum energy, we're talking about subatomic particles of energy, or the quantum streams of energy, energy in its lowest, purest, simplest form. Quanta units of energy, or quanta units of what we would call sensory impulses, then are the smallest bits of information one can ever receive. And those quanta information then are the construct of words. Remember, words are like the subatomic particles of speech or thought, concepts or principles. And so I say that the quanta principles, when we talk about quanta units, they are words. These words can even be the suffix of a larger word, or the prefix of a larger word, like prolegomena, pro. Pro, then, even though it is a seed form, within the seed is so much material that ultimately will produce principles of beforehand operating, principles of thinking before you even construct a discourse, thinking before you even categorize which thoughts should be together. And so the seed, the quanta unit of thought, then, is a word. And these, what we call quanta units, are the sensory impulses, what your mind receives through all of its senses that connects it to an external existence, whether that be natural or whether it be spiritual. And so these impulses that are, again, any physical or pneumatic sensory impulse that comes to you, that is used to create quanta phrases of principles. A quanta phrase, then, noun, is a collective of either suffix, prefix, or words themselves that now bring forth principles or foundational meanings that can become something much more extended. They can also become principles that become concepts. Concepts are greater ideals, or the foundation of ideals that lead you into other ideals, or what we call, the study of logic, the study of ology, moving here and there logically, moving from this position to that position, this perspective. That's what observation is, being able to change your perspective to get a view of what you're looking at. Examination is now you're getting a greater view of the internals of what you have observed. And then analyzation is taking every aspect of what you have examined, seeing the dynamics within it, how this thing operates with something else. What are the dynamics that keep them operating? What are the dynamics that bring them into the functionality of their purpose within a system? And then these quanta phrases or principles, which become concepts, then become the discursive or the expanded version of a concept. So you're literally talking about a treatise or a thesis, an expanded thesis of a narrow subject that can be used to tie in other thesi. And so all categorical structure begins with the mensiological. So it begins with the actions of the mind. The mens produces information or informational quanta units, which are perhaps one word, one suffix, one prefix. The mensiological, or the mens, then produces informational phrases of two words or more, or of two parts of a word or more. And then it will produce concepts from the phrases. And ultimately, the concepts are synthesized into discourse. And the discourse then now expands into the thinker of the thought of thought, or the human logos that is patterned after the categorical powers and ability of the divine logos. And we are going to stop right